What if the one thing standing between you and everything you've ever wanted was not money or luck or the right connections, but a single mental habit that almost nobody has ever been taught to use on purpose? A little over 100 years ago, a widowed woman with no formal training in philosophy walked into the office of a New Thought practitioner in New York City, picked up a strange, difficult little book by a retired judge from India, and within a few short years had attracted $20,000 seemingly out of thin air, crossed an entire ocean, and become the one and only private student the greatest mental scientist of her generation ever accepted in his lifetime. She would go on to teach thousands of ordinary men and women a method so simple a child could grasp it, and yet so quietly powerful that people use it to build fortunes, restore their health, rescue failing businesses, and pull themselves back from the edge of despair. By the end of this recording, you're going to know exactly what that method is in careful, practical detail. You will hear, in her own remarkable story, precisely how she used it, step by step, to change the entire direction of her life. And you'll be given clear, simple instructions for using that very same power in your own. So find a comfortable place to settle in, because what you are about to hear has been quietly reshaping lives for over a century, and it is about to become yours to use as well. Her name was Genevieve Behrend, and the book you are about to hear is her masterwork, called Your Invisible Power, first published in 1921. Behrend was not a philosopher by training, and she never claimed to be. She was, by her own account, a young widow drifting from country to country in the years after her husband's death, surrounded by friends who considered her fortunate, comfortable, and free, and yet privately carrying a deep and persistent sense of loneliness that none of her circumstances could touch. She tried Christian Science, and found she could not accept its foundations. Even while admiring the good work its practitioners were doing, she sought out a celebrated spiritual teacher who told her, almost in passing, that she would travel the world searching for truth and would one day speak aloud herself, a statement that felt impossible at the time, and yet planted a small, stubborn seed of encouragement in her mind. And then, quite by accident, in the office of New Thought practitioner, her eye fell on a slim volume titled The Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, written by a man named Thomas Troward. That single book changed the entire direction of her life. Troward was a retired divisional judge from the Punjab in India, and in his retirement, he had developed what he called mental science, a careful, reasoned account of the relationship between the individual human mind and what he termed the universal mind. Behrend studied his writings so intensely and with such devotion that she eventually crossed the Atlantic determined to become his personal student, even though Troward, when first approached, firmly and repeatedly declined take on any private pupils whatsoever. What happened next? How she won him over through nothing more than patience, faith, and one remarkable coincidence involving a cat and an astrologer, and how she eventually became his one and only personal student, is a story you'll hear in full later in this very recording, told largely in her own words, reshaped for your ear. After completing her studies with Troward, Behrend spent the remainder of her life teaching what she had learned. First through a school she founded in New York City, called the School of the Builders, then through another school in Los Angeles, and finally as a celebrated traveling lecturer across North America for more than 3 decades. What she taught at its heart is a single elegant idea that your mind is not a passive mirror, simply reflecting your circumstances back to you, but an active, living center of creative power, that the pictures you hold steadily in your imagination, held with genuine faith and without anxious strain, tend naturally to work themselves out into physical, concrete reality, and that none of this is mysticism or wishful thinking. But law, every bit as exact and dependable as the law that lifts an airplane into open sky, or the law that fixes an image onto a photographic plate. This is the very book that generations of readers have turned to whenever they wanted to change their outward circumstances by first changing the quiet, private world of their own thought. So let's begin exactly where Behrend herself begins, with the purpose she had in mind when she sat down to write every single page of this book. Genevieve Behrend tells us plainly, right at the very outset, why she felt compelled to write this book in the first place. She wrote it, she says, to place directly into your hand a key capable of unlocking fulfillment of your own deepest desires. And she wanted, above every other consideration, for you to release fear entirely from your consciousness as you reach for that key. Because fear, more than any other single force, is what keeps most people locked outside the very door they are trying so hard to open. Underneath every desire for more money, more friendship, more security, or more freedom, Behrend tells us there lies a deeper and more fundamental desire, and that is simply the desire for greater happiness. You believe, quite reasonably, that certain possessions or circumstances, once achieved, will bring you a fuller sense of freedom and contentment, and your desire to possess them grows directly out of that conviction. But Behrend wants you to understand something crucial before you take another step forward into this book. No person, no place, and no object can actually hand happiness to you directly, no matter how earnestly you might wish they could. At best, they can only provide the occasion or the setting for happiness. The true joy of living, she insists, always rises up from somewhere deep within you and cannot be manufactured from the outside, no matter how much external abundance you manage to accumulate. She illustrates this immediately with a story from her own teaching practice. One morning, after a class she had given, a man approached her in genuine desperation over money. He offered her a $5 bill, explaining through obvious embarrassment that this represented literally half of everything he possessed in the entire world, that he was deeply in debt, and that his wife and child did not even have proper clothing to wear. She gently explained to him that money is simply a symbol, a visible representation of a much deeper and more abundant substance that fills a whole space, that this substance was already present for him at that very moment, waiting only to be recognized and claimed. He protested that surely such help would come too late to save him. She assured him it could not possibly come too late, because this substance exists eternally in the present, never delayed and never withheld. He left her that day, quietly lifted by the conversation. 6 months later, a letter arrived from him, postmarked New Orleans, where he had reestablished himself entirely, now owning his own home, driving his own automobile, and once again working successfully in his profession as a photographer. Only 3 days after that conversation in New York, he wrote, a man he had not seen in years happened to encounter him on the street, and upon hearing of his troubles, loaned him exactly the money he needed to settle his debts and relocate south to begin again. He enclosed a check of his own, asking Behrend to use in continuing her work of teaching others how to mentally reach out and receive their own unfailing supply. Behrend offers this story as living proof of the very principle this entire book rests upon, that when you take the time to genuinely understand what she calls the law of visualization, and then apply that understanding faithfully and without straining your own life, remarkable results reliably follow, not because the laws of the universe have somehow been broken or bent on your behalf, but because you have finally learned how to consciously cooperate with laws that were operating all along, whether you notice them or not. Now, let us move together into her very first chapter, which she titles The Order of Visualization. Behrend tells us that the moment you begin practicing visualization in earnest, deliberately picturing your desire and examining it with real attention, your entire mental life begins settling into a completely new kind of order. Your scattered thoughts and half-formed desires start arranging themselves, one after another, into a calm and orderly procession, rather than the anxious, chaotic jumble that most untrained minds live with day after day. And once your mind has reached this new state of order, something quite remarkable happens. You find yourself no longer living inside a state of constant mental hurry. And hurry, Barron reminds us pointedly, is really nothing more than fear wearing a more socially acceptable disguise. It is inherently destructive, precisely because it works directly against the very harmony it is desperately trying to produce. Everyone visualizes, she insists, whether they realize it consciously or not. This is simply how the human mind naturally operates. The crucial difference is that most people do it carelessly and unconsciously, drifting from one half-formed worry to the next, while select few learn to do it with real deliberation. And it is precisely this conscious, disciplined use of the power that attracts dramatically greater resources into a person's life, sharpens their practical wisdom, and reveals advantages that have been sitting in plain sight the entire time, simply unnoticed, to make all of this vivid and concrete. Behrend points her readers toward the invention of the airplane. Nothing whatsoever about the underlying laws of nature changed on the day the Wright brothers first achieved power flight. The very same laws that govern the physical world had been just as fully available 1,000 years earlier and 1,000 years before that. What actually changed was that someone, at long last, learned how to work skillfully with those laws in a properly orderly fashion, rather than simply assuming the whole enterprise was impossible merely because it had never once been accomplished before. She recalls how, decades before power flight was ever achieved, an English nobleman named Henry Cavendish proved that a particular gas was many times lighter than ordinary atmospheric air. And from that single scientific discovery came the hot air balloon, and eventually the elongated, steerable airship, and eventually, through the patient dedication of dreamers who refused to release their mental picture, the fully realized airplane itself. She reminds us of Professor Langley in Washington, whose early model airplane was mocked mercilessly by the press after it plunged nose first into the muddy waters of the Potomac River, and yet whose careful theoretical groundwork was later built upon successfully by others. The Wright brothers themselves were doubted, ridiculed, and dismissed by nearly everyone around them. And yet one brother would console the other during their many failed experiments by saying, quite simply, that he could already see himself riding steadily and easily inside that very machine. They held their picture patiently through every setback, and eventually the physical world caught up entirely with what they had already accomplished again and again inside their own imaginations. This, Behrend tells us, is precisely what visualization truly is. Not some presumptuous attempt to bend or break the fixed laws of nature, but rather a patient, disciplined act of fulfilling those laws exactly as they were always meant to be fulfilled. When you learn to visualize properly, she assures us, you are never stealing anything away from another person, because you're never actually competing for some limited, fixed supply of good things. You're simply learning, deliberately and skillfully, to set the plastic, formless substance of the universe flowing steadily into the precise shape your own clear desire has already prepared to receive it. From this foundation, Behrend takes us a good deal deeper, into exactly how this quiet process of attraction actually works beneath the surface. She compares the creative power within you that forms a mental picture to an old-fashioned magic lantern. That once familiar device which projected glowing images onto a screen through a single steady beam of light. Your own imagination, in this comparison, is a picture slide itself, entirely invisible and lifeless until you consciously switch on the light of your will. That light is your faith, your calm, absolute confidence that the creative spirit already living within you is doing the actual work on your behalf. And when that light shines steadily, without flickering or wavering, your picture is faithfully projected outward onto the screen of your physical world, appearing there as an exact reproduction of whatever you've been quietly holding inside your mind. But if the light behind that lantern flickers, shifting uncertainly from one side to the other, the picture that finally appears on the outward screen will flicker and blur along with it, uncertain and incomplete, just like the effect of an unsteady will. This is precisely why Behrend insists, again and again throughout this book, that the true strength of your mental picture depends entirely on how steadily you are able to hold in place, not on how desperately you happen to want the thing in question, and not on how frequently your mind wanders back to think about it in passing. She offers a story of an ordinary businessman who developed the simple daily habit of spending a few quiet minutes each morning before breakfast reviewing his affairs calmly in his own imagination, and then deliberately expanding that picture, seeing himself succeeding gracefully in every single interaction awaiting him that day, meeting the many strangers his work required him to meet, understanding their needs, and supplying those needs exactly as they wished. Within only 6 months, he reported, his business had more than doubled in size, not because his outward circumstances had suddenly turned kinder toward him by chance, but because he had patiently learned to steady the light behind his own inner lantern. Behrend also gently addresses a quiet fear that many beginners carry without admitting aloud, the worry that some other person might be visualizing for that exact same outcome at that exact same moment, making the two of you unwitting rivals for the very same prize. She reassures her readers that this fear rests on a fundamental misunderstanding. Your mental picture is never some isolated, private scheme cooked up in competitive secrecy against the rest of humanity. It is, quite literally, the universal creative power itself expressing its own inherent, generous nature specifically through you as an individual, and the deep law of harmony that governs the entire universe simply does not permit that kind of destructive collision to occur. Everything that exists anywhere, she reminds us, first came into being through this exact same process of self-differentiation. First the idea, the mental picture, the invisible prototype of thing, and only afterward, following naturally from that, the solid, visible, physical form. If you find yourself wishing for a more orderly room, the very desire for order is already quietly suggesting the shelves, the hooks, and the boxes that will eventually hold that order firmly in place. The physical object you eventually acquire or build is simply the original idea completing its own natural cycle. Now, some readers, Behrend openly acknowledges in her next chapter, feel a certain quiet uneasiness about visualizing for purely material things. It can feel a little too worldly, a little too concerned with mere possessions, to some more spiritually inclined readers she encountered throughout her years of teaching. But Behrend pushes back firmly and directly against this common hesitation. Material form, she insists, is absolutely necessary if spirit is ever going to recognize itself from an individual point of view at all. Matter, in her understanding, is not some regrettable illusion that a truly enlightened person ought to somehow rise above. as certain metaphysical teachers of our own era were fond of suggesting. Matter is, quite simply, the necessary and honored channel through which spirit accomplishes its ongoing work of self-differentiation throughout the visible world. She borrows a particularly striking image from her teacher Troward in order to explain why creation itself seems to appear so unevenly scattered across the vastness of the universe, blazing with activity in some regions while remaining utterly still and empty in others, even though the very same raw material sits equally available absolutely everywhere. The individual particles of primary universal substance, all resting together in a state of perfect equilibrium with one another, simply cannot be the true underlying source of any movement, because not a single one of those particles possesses any greater inherent power to initiate motion than any of its countless neighbors. There must therefore be some other factor at work, something operating in and through those particles without being strictly identical to them. And this additional factor is precisely what Troward, and Behrend after him, mean whenever they speak of spirit. And here, quite plainly, is the central point Behrend most wants you to genuinely feel and absorb, not merely understand intellectually. The very same power that once brought entire solar systems spinning into being out of raw, undifferentiated substance is, at this exact moment, fully available to bring your own mental picture into equally solid physical form. There exists no fundamental difference in kind whatsoever between that vast cosmic power and the quiet power currently working through your own private imagination. The only genuine difference between the two is simply one of scale. You are, in the truest and most literal sense Behrend can offer, that very same infinite creative energy, narrowed down and sharply focused through the specific, individual center of your own particular mind. We arrive now at a moment I especially want you to sit with, because it truly is a hinge upon which this entire book turns. Behrend explains the actual working operation of your mental picture through the memorable image of an old-fashioned telephone exchange system. The great central switchboard divides itself outward into countless smaller branch stations scattered across the whole network, and each individual branch, whenever it finds itself in genuine need of new supplies or urgent repairs, always and naturally reports that need directly back to its own proper central source, never mistakenly to some entirely unrelated telegraph network operating nearby. In precisely the same fashion, Behrend tells us, you yourself are simply one branch of the great universal mind, and whenever you carry your own needs confidently back to that same original source, using the very methods that source has already faithfully provided for exactly this purpose, your needs are reliably met, just as Jesus himself once promised when he said that we need only ask in order to receive. Behrend reminds us here that nothing which exists anywhere in creation ever manages to stand out entirely on its own, entirely by itself. Everything without exception is called forth into visible existence by some underlying power that itself remains permanently invisible to ordinary sight. The mental picture you now hold, and the deeper substance quietly supporting your own desire, does not itself ever stand out into plain view. It simply projects outward a solidified, physical counterpart of itself, while the originating power remains forever unseen by the physical eye. She quotes the ancient words of the Apostle Paul here, that the visible world itself was originally formed by the spoken word of an unseen creative power, so that the very things we can plainly see did not, in their deepest origin, arise from other things that themselves merely appear on the surface. Your own personal advancement through life, Behrend tells us directly, depends almost entirely on how skillfully you learn to use this power of visualizing, and your effective use of that power depends, in turn, on whether you have truly come to recognize that you yourself function as a very specific individual center through which the same originating spirit continues to discover fresh new ways of expressing possibilities that were already quietly present within its own infinite nature. She offers here a wonderfully simple, almost domestic little example to help bring this lofty idea firmly down to earth. A young woman deeply engaged in studying music found herself wishing so intensely for a piano of her own that she could genuinely picture it in vivid detail, sitting comfortably in the corner of her own living room. She held on to that clear image faithfully, savored in advance the pleasure and advantage it would surely bring her, and one day, quite naturally and without any dramatic intervention, she discovered the piano sitting exactly where she had so often pictured it standing. Behrend also raises here, quite directly, the obvious and difficult question this whole line of thinking inevitably provokes. If the same creative power truly runs through every single human mind without exception, then why does the world remain so visibly filled with sickness, suffering, and poverty? Her answer is refreshingly direct and unflinching. Most people, she says plainly, simply never take the necessary trouble to carefully investigate the actual working principle underlying these laws of themselves. If they genuinely did take that trouble, she insists, they would quickly discover that there exists no real necessity whatsoever for so much of the suffering that so many people have simply learned, quietly and passively, to accept as unavoidable. The creative energy in question always flows steadily in whatever direction your own habitual, repeated thought happens to indicate, which is precisely why the ongoing discipline of learning to hold a clear, steady mental picture matters so enormously. And Behrend adds here a striking, almost counterintuitive piece of practical advice that many readers find surprising on first hearing it. Hold your picture as a closely guarded secret between yourself and your own inner consciousness and nobody else. The very moment you speak your private desire aloud to another person, she warns quite plainly, some real measure of its underlying power quietly leaks away and is lost. Not because sharing your hopes with others is somehow forbidden or wrong, but because most people, when they do talk about their private desires, are really doing so in order to relieve their own anxious inward pressure. And in doing so, they inadvertently scatter the very concentrated energy they should instead be carefully gathering and holding together before we move further into the true heart of this remarkable book. I want to pause here for just a brief moment and ask you to do one small thing for me. If this particular way of thinking about your own mind and about the shape of your own future is genuinely resonating with you as you listen, please take just a moment right now to hit that subscribe button below. This channel exists entirely to bring you exactly this kind of timeless, practical wisdom, drawn carefully from the great teachers of the New Thought tradition, so that you never once miss the next book that could genuinely change the whole direction of your own life, the way this very book once changed the direction of Genevieve Behrend's. All right, with that said, let us return now to Behrend herself and to the many ordinary people whose lives were quietly and permanently transformed by this very same principle. In her chapter Gathering Together Expressions from Beginners, Behrend shares a rich collection of real, first-hand accounts sent to her over the years by students and readers who had personally put this principle into daily practice. A famous military general, during the difficult years of the Franco-Prussian War, feeling utterly humiliated by the course the fighting had taken, deliberately pictured himself leading a triumphant French army to eventual victory, made his picture with quiet determination, and then, in his own words, simply smoked his pipe and calmly waited for events to unfold. A well-known and celebrated actress described, in a lengthy newspaper article, exactly how she reshaped the entire appearance of her own figure simply by holding a steady, unwavering mental image of the body she genuinely wished to have. A doctor's wife, who had been raised in real poverty on the east side of New York City, had quietly cherished, ever since earliest girlhood, a persistent dream of one day marrying a physician. That gentle image remained with her so faithfully over the years that it eventually became the very shape her own life ultimately took, and years later, she and her husband together held a second shared picture, this time of owning and running a fruit farm somewhere in the American South, and Behrend received her letter directly from that very farm, describing her fulfilled second dream in loving detail. Behrend also tells the memorable story of an elderly woman arrested in Atlantic City for stealing a simple bottle of milk, having grown genuinely desperate with hunger, who turned out, entirely by coincidence, to be the very same woman a local judge had been quietly searching for over many months in order to deliver a $500 inheritance left to her by a distant relative. She had, without any concrete knowledge of how it might possibly reach her, been faithfully holding on to a mental picture of that exact sum for a very long time. And Barron fondly recalls the story of the great American railway builder who, long before a single physical rail had ever actually been laid down across the countryside, would spend countless quiet hours sitting alone with detailed maps spread out before him, mentally traveling the entire proposed route his railroad would one day faithfully follow, coast to coast, again and again in his own patient imagination. In every single one of these varied stories, Barron wants you to notice carefully the exact same underlying pattern repeating itself. A genuinely clear picture, calmly and persistently held over time, entirely without any anxious grasping at the precise mechanism by which that picture might eventually arrive in physical form. This naturally leads Behrend into some genuinely practical, hands-on instruction concerning exactly how you yourself should go about constructing your own mental picture, step by careful step. She recommends choosing a quiet, undisturbed moment each day, ideally just before breakfast in the morning, and then again just before sleep at night, times when your own mind is naturally at its calmest and most receptive to gentle suggestion. Go into a room where you know you will not be disturbed, she advises, and reflect quietly for a few unhurried moments on exactly how everything currently surrounding you first came into being as nothing more than a simple, formless idea. Even something as ordinary and unremarkable as a plain wooden chair, she points out, originally began as nothing more than a felt desire for comfort, long before it ever became a solid, physical object you could actually sit upon. Barron then walks us carefully through a short breathing exercise she personally practiced on a regular basis. Open a nearby window if you can. Take roughly 10 slow, deep, unhurried breaths. And as you draw each breath steadily inward, imagine a great, brilliant circle of light surrounding your entire body on every side, its warm rays entering you from every possible direction and gradually gathering together at your own central point. Hold that gathered light briefly at your center, then exhale slowly and completely, imagining it now spreading gently back outward through your entire body, and finally down and out to the soles of your feet. Once the simple exercise is fully complete, sit upright in a comfortable position and quietly affirm to yourself that there truly exists only one single life, one underlying substance throughout the whole universe, and that this very substance is, at this exact moment, finding genuine pleasure in recognizing itself specifically through you. Only once you have settled fully into that calm, receptive state should you actually begin constructing your picture in earnest. If your particular desire happens to be a new home, Walk through it carefully in your own imagination, one room at a time, noticing thoughtfully where each window is placed, what furniture fills each room, even pausing for a moment to look into a mirror and notice how healthy, prosperous, and genuinely happy you appear standing there. Go over the same picture again and again, patiently, until it begins to feel entirely real and solid to you. And then Barron firmly suggests write the whole picture down carefully in your own words, exactly as you have seen in your mind. Close it with a simple, confident affirmation that the very best there is already yours, because your own mind is quite literally a center divine operation. She then offers us a short but genuinely powerful set of practical points to remember when using this thought power to deliberately produce new conditions in your own life. Know very clearly and specifically what condition you actually wish to produce, and then weigh carefully what further results the eventual accomplishment of that desire will realistically lead you toward. Understand that simply allow your thought to dwell steadily on a mental picture naturally concentrates the surrounding creative spirit at that exact point, bringing all its scattered forces gradually into a state of settled balance. Recognize that visualizing steadies your ordinary conscious mind, allowing you to consciously direct the flow of spirit toward one single, clearly recognized purpose, rather than carelessly allow your thought energy to scatter itself in every possible direction at once. Remember always that you are working here with a vast reservoir of potential energy that has not yet been shaped into any particular final form, and that it is entirely your own mental picture that quietly provides that missing direction. Remember, too, and this point matters enormously, that strenuous, anxious, forceful effort actually defeats your own purpose in the end, because it inevitably suggests the presence of some opposing force you must struggle against, and that very suggestion itself creates precisely the resistance it secretly fears. Hold your picture instead in a genuinely cheerful, relaxed frame of mind, and understand clearly that the true underlying purpose of your picture is never to personally arrange every specific circumstance of its own eventual fulfillment. That particular work belongs entirely to creative power itself, which will faithfully build its own channels of expression through avenues you could never possibly have anticipated or engineered on your own. And finally, never forget, Barron insists one last time, that every physical thing currently present in your life, whether it now serves you well or works quietly against you, was first a sustained, repeated thought long before it ever became a solid, physical thing. Your own habitual thoughts, then, quite simply and quite literally, are the things you either possess or fail to possess. Now Barron turns inward once again and shares with us her own personal story in fuller detail, explaining exactly why she first took up this particular study to begin with. It began, she openly confesses, not with any grand ambition, but rather with a genuinely overwhelming sense of loneliness that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. She had been a widow for roughly 3 years at that point, drifting restlessly from country to country, and although her friends around her generally regarded her as remarkably fortunate, financially comfortable, and entirely free to do as she pleased, she privately carried within herself a deep and persistent sense of emptiness that no amount of pleasant society could ever quite manage to touch or heal. She tried Christian Science for a time and found she simply could not accept its underlying foundations, even while genuinely admiring the good work its dedicated practitioners were accomplishing in the world. She sought out a celebrated and much revered spiritual teacher who told her, almost as an offhand remark, that she would travel throughout the entire world in search of truth and would eventually come to speak that truth aloud herself, a statement that felt utterly impossible to her at the time. and yet quietly planted a small, stubborn seed of genuine encouragement deep within her mind. And then, in the modest office of a New Thought practitioner, her attention happened to fall upon a slim volume titled The Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, written by a certain Thomas Troward. That single, unassuming book changed the entire direction of her life from that day forward. She found the book far more difficult to absorb than she had first expected, and purchased a second volume of Troward's writing in the hope that it might prove somewhat easier going, only to discover, as so many readers before and since have similarly discovered, that this material demanded to be genuinely studied over time, not simply read once through and set aside. She spent literally weeks and months slowly working her way through even the very first chapter of that second book, until one single paragraph, appearing on its 26th page, struck her suddenly with the full force of genuine revelation. The striking idea that her own individual mind was, in fact, a center of divine operation, that this divine operation always moves naturally toward expansion and fuller expression, consistently producing something genuinely new rather than simply repeating the same tired patterns of the past over and over again. She memorized that particular paragraph word for word, repeated it quietly to herself constantly throughout her days, and felt, for what seemed like the very first time in years, a genuine and steadily rising sense of inner peace beginning to settle over her. If the divine truly could not change its own essential nature, she reasoned, and the divine was genuinely operating through her own individual mind, then her entire world of circumstances, friendships, and daily conditions was surely bound, sooner or later, to become a world defined by real contentment, with herself standing quite literally at its very center. All she needed to do now, she realized with growing clarity, was learn to govern her own mind skillfully enough to become a genuinely fit and steady center through which that divine creative energy could freely work. That single moment of realization led her directly into what may well be the single most famous story contained anywhere within this entire book. The story of exactly how Behrend managed to attract to herself the full sum of $20,000. She needed that particular sum of money in order to travel to England and study formally under Troward, even though, at that early point, she did not yet even know for certain whether he accepted private students of any kind at all. And so, long before she ever worked up the courage to ask that particular question directly, she began repeating her carefully memorized statement almost hourly throughout each day, that her own mind was a center of divine operation, and that divine operation always meant genuine expansion into something better than whatever had come immediately before it. Every single night before falling asleep, she deliberately pictured 20 individual $1,000 bills, carefully counting them out one by one in her own vivid imagination, and then, in order to further impress this picture firmly upon her own mind, she wrote the entire scene down in detail, seeing herself purchasing her own steamer ticket, walking calmly along the ship's open deck during the long crossing from New York to London, and finally, most importantly of all, seeing herself formally accepted as Troward's own personal pupil. She held on to this picture faithfully, morning and evening without fail, deliberately keeping her own mind well away from any anxious speculation about exactly where such a considerable sum of money might realistically come from, largely because, as she candidly admits, she genuinely had no clear way of imagining any plausible source for such an amount at that point in her life. One day, while out walking briskly and taking slow, deliberate, deep breaths, a striking thought suddenly rose up within her, that her own mind truly was a center of divine operation, and if God genuinely filled the whole of space without exception, then God must surely be fully present within her own mind as well, and therefore both the money she needed and the deeper truth she was genuinely seeking must, in some very real sense, already belong to her, even though she could neither see nor physically feel their tangible presence just yet. In that particular moment, something within her seemed to shift entirely. An overwhelming wave of pure joy swept completely over her entire being, so complete and so total that every remaining thought of money, of Troward, and even her own individual personality simply dissolved away entirely, replaced instead by an overwhelming sense of being fully and directly in touch with the whole of life itself. She walked on and on through the streets that day with this powerful feeling of joy steadily increasing and expanding within her until everything around her, every person she happened to pass along the way, seemed to glow with a kind of resplendent inner light, as though every trace of ordinary separate personality had simply disappeared entirely, replaced by that same overwhelming sense of joy and quiet contentment. That night, when she made her nightly picture the $20,000 once again, the entire experience felt completely different from before, effortless rather than effortful, natural rather than strained. And from that particular point forward, one small circumstance after another began quietly pointing her toward the exact sum she needed, until, roughly 6 weeks later, the complete $20,000 sat safely deposited in her own personal bank account, precisely as she had so faithfully pictured it. She is careful to add here one particularly crucial piece of guidance she received directly from Troward himself, that the very moment any small circumstance appears pointing in the right general direction, however minor or insignificant it might initially seem, you should calmly regard it as the very first sprout of the seed you have already planted, and simply do, without any excitement or undue urgency, whatever that particular circumstance seems to genuinely require of you next. One deliberate step will naturally lead you toward another, until you eventually find yourself, almost without quite noticing exactly how it happened, standing firmly in the full, complete accomplishment of what you once could only faintly imagine, with the necessary money now fully secured. Behrend's early letters to Troward, initially sent on her behalf through a mutual friend, went entirely unanswered for a considerable while, and even after she finally did receive a courteous reply, Troward stated quite plainly and directly that he simply did not take on private pupils, and had no available time whatsoever to devote to instructing one personally. Yet Behrend, still carrying within her the vivid memory of that illuminated moment out on the street, refused to let this particular door close entirely and permanently. She and a close friend traveled to England regardless, wrote once again to Troward directly from London, and were eventually granted a brief personal interview at his remote country home in Cornwall, arriving there, as it happened, in the middle of a genuinely terrific rainstorm. Troward received her warmly enough on that visit, spoke pleasantly of nearly everything except her actual request, and only as she was finally leaving did he soften just slightly, suggesting she might write to him again once she had reached Paris, and that perhaps come autumn some arrangement could possibly be made after all. Writing faithfully to him from Paris over the following weeks, she received, roughly 2 months later, an unexpected and rather curious letter posing a very strange question indeed, asking her to interpret a particular verse taken from the book of Revelation, one describing a great city measured equally in length, breadth, and height. Sensing quite instinctively that her acceptance as his formal student somehow depended entirely on providing the correct answer to this single question, she consulted scholars, lawyers, priests, and clergy from all across the world, and yet her own intuition told her clearly, again and again, that none of their many answers were genuinely correct. While searching through the old bookstores of Paris for certain volumes Troward had personally recommended to her, she found herself, almost entirely against her own better judgment, standing inside the private office of one of France's most celebrated astrologers, a man who quite firmly did not read horoscopes for casual strangers under any circumstances, until one of his large Persian cats, quite unexpectedly and without any apparent reason, leapt directly up into her lap, an event so genuinely unusual that his entire manner toward her softened almost immediately when she finally worked up sufficient courage to ask him about that puzzling verse from Revelation. He answered her at once, without a single moment's hesitation, explaining that the city in question represented truth itself, and that truth is fundamentally non-invertible, appearing exactly the same regardless of which particular side you happen to approach it from. The very instant she heard his answer, she simply knew, with complete and total certainty, that this was indeed the correct one. She wired that answer to Troward immediately, and his reply came back to her just as quickly, confirming plainly that she had answered entirely correctly, and warmly inviting her to attend an upcoming course of lectures he was about to deliver in London, after which, he added, satisfactory arrangements for her formal study could very likely be made at last. She attended every single one of those lectures faithfully, remained in London afterward, and shortly before finally departing for Cornwall, received a long, remarkably candid, and genuinely thoughtful letter from Troward himself, carefully explaining exactly what kind of instruction she should honestly expect to receive from him. He made entirely clear that he held no interest whatsoever in occult systems of any kind, in theosophy, in the tarot, or in any of what he personally considered the fashionable mysticism so common in certain circles of his own day, and that his teacher would instead center almost entirely on the careful study of Scripture and on the deep relationship between the individual soul and Christ, delivered simply and directly through ordinary friendly conversation rather than any kind of formal lecture setting. And so it was through this remarkable and winding sequence of events that Genevieve Behrend finally became, in historical fact, the one and only personal pupil Thomas Troward ever formally accepted in his entire lifetime. From this significant point onward, Behrend turns her attention away from her own personal story and back toward the deeper underlying principles Troward carefully taught her, beginning first with exactly how to bring the power contained within your own spoken word into genuine practical action. Every single word you speak, she tells us, carries quietly within itself a kind of living germ, a hidden seed that expands and projects itself steadily in exactly the direction that particular word indicates, eventually taking on solid physical expression in your outward life. If you genuinely wish to cultivate a deeper sense of joy within yourself, she suggests simply repeat the word joy quietly to yourself, persistently and with real feeling behind it, and you will soon find that genuine joy actually does begin expanding steadily within your own being. This is not, she insists firmly, mere idle fancy or wishful thinking, but rather an observable, testable fact, something you are fully capable of confirming for yourself through your own direct personal experience. Joy always rises up from somewhere deep within. She reminds us once again, other people or favorable circumstances may certainly provide you a legitimate reason to feel joyful, but no other person can ever actually manufacture that genuine inner joy directly on your own behalf. And because thought itself is fundamentally creative in nature, being neither inherently good nor inherently bad, but simply created by its own essential character, This is precisely why genuine faith consistently builds up whatever fear just as consistently tends to tear back down. Faith, Behrend clarifies carefully, need not necessarily be faith directed toward any one single specific outcome. It can simply be faith in your own best and highest self, held steadily and confidently across every single circumstance life happens to bring your way. Naturally enough, this raises the very same practical questions so many beginning students inevitably ask themselves at some point. How exactly can you manage to speak with genuine faith when you honestly feel you possess very little of it, or perhaps none at all? Behrend's answer here proves refreshingly direct and practical. Every single living creature, she points out, already possesses faith in something or other. Even fear itself, properly understood, is really nothing more than faith pointed quietly in an unfortunate, negative direction. You fear illness only because some part of your own mind already genuinely believes it entirely possible for illness to reach and affect you, and you fear poverty for that exact same underlying reason. What truly shapes the overall course of your life, Behrend explains carefully, is never merely the occasional passing wish or fleeting hope, but rather your consistent, habitual, repeated pattern of thought, whatever quietly and persistently recurs within your mind day after day after day. So Behrend recommends here a genuinely concrete daily practice worth adopting. Look back carefully across your own personal past for specific moments when you truly had to summon up a noticeably better frame of mind, or moments when you genuinely needed some particular thing and somehow, against the odds, actually managed to obtain it, and then deliberately relive those exact moments in vivid memory again and again until you feel yourself genuinely back in touch with that same capable, quietly confident self who already, deep down, knows precisely how to accomplish this. As your own faith continues growing steadily through this kind of regular practice, Behrend explains, you gradually begin reaping what she calls a reward of increased faith. You come to understand not merely as some abstract philosophical idea, but as a genuinely lived, felt reality, that you are not simply a helpless victim being tossed about randomly by outside circumstance, but rather an actual, functioning part of the universe itself, woven directly into its own underlying fabric. This growing understanding gives you the genuine capacity to consciously connect with universal law itself and press the countless forces of nature, both visible and invisible alike, firmly into the active service of your own genuine, heartfelt desires. Schroeder personally taught her that this particular kind of mastery comes about entirely through knowledge, specifically through the deep knowledge of exactly how the personal element present within each of us relates directly back to the universal spirit from which it originally sprang. Every single word you think, every thought you privately hold, is in a very real and literal sense a miniature reproduction of that same universal spirit actively working through you as a specific individual. And this fundamental principle is precisely why disappointment and outright failure so often trace back, upon careful examination, to one single, simple, avoidable error, the persistent habit of trying to think one particular thing while somehow simultaneously expecting an entirely different, contradictory result to follow from it. Water, after all, simply cannot flow in a perfectly straight line through a crooked, twisted pipe. And in exactly the same way, thought itself cannot possibly produce a final outcome that directly contradicts its own original inner shape. This remarkably sensitive creative substance simply reproduces outwardly, with perfect fidelity, whatever form your own inner thought has already quietly given it beforehand. From this point, Behrend goes on to show us exactly how to make the whole of nature itself genuinely respond to us. there exists. She tells us with real conviction, an intelligence, and a power running continuously through all of nature and throughout the whole space, endlessly creative in its own essential nature, and remarkably sensitive to gentle suggestion at every turn. Once you truly and deeply grasp that your own individual mind is genuinely a center of this same divine operation, you begin noticing something quite remarkable unfolding in your daily life. Helpful suggestions gradually start arriving toward you from every conceivable direction, not merely from the other people surrounding you, but even, in a very real and tangible sense, from a natural world itself, and you steadily become capable of acting on these gentle inward promptings with genuine confidence and assurance. As Barron memorably puts it here, faith entirely without any accompanying action remains essentially lifeless and inert, but faith genuinely joined together with real action sets you completely and permanently free. She illustrates this particular principle beautifully through the memorable story of an Australian bushman named Tyson, laboring for only a few modest shillings a day, who found himself strangely and unexpectedly moved by the sight of a small wild violet growing quietly in a place where almost nothing else around it seemed able to survive at all. Something present within that humble little flower touched something corresponding deep within him, and he began night after night, sitting quietly on the edge of his own bunk, imagining the vast, arid desert lands of Australia gradually transformed into genuinely blossoming, fertile country. He deliberately set aside any anxious mental calculation of exactly how such an enormous undertaking could realistically be financed, and simply continued holding faithfully to his picture, and in time, doors of finance he could never have anticipated or personally engineered open up before him in remarkable and unexpected ways, until he eventually became recognized as one of the truly great figures in the entire history of Australian agriculture and irrigation. Barron draws out three essential, foundational facts from this particular story that she genuinely wants you to hold on to carefully going forward. First, that the whole space is thoroughly filled with genuinely creative power, without exception. Second, that this same creative power proves remarkably responsive to conscious suggestion. And third, that it works exclusively through deductive methods, meaning it always takes its fundamental cue entirely from the specific character of the thought you personally offer it, without ever being limited or constrained in any way by past precedent or prior historical experience. We are drawing near now to the end of this shared journey, and Barron closes out her book with genuinely detailed, thoroughly practical guidance concerning prayer itself, on precisely how to ask in such a way that real, tangible results reliably follow. The essential underlying principle here, she tells us, borrowed directly from Scripture itself, is simply to ask while genuinely believing that you have already received, and only then, she promises, shall you truly receive. This particular instruction sounds considerably more difficult at first hearing than it actually proves to be in practice. It becomes far simpler to grasp once you fully understand that everything without exception genuinely begins first in the mind, so that whatever you happen to be seeking on the outside, in the physical world, you have, in a very real and meaningful sense, already begun possessing the very moment you first thought of it clearly and with genuine feeling. She recommends rising early each morning, ideally somewhere around 5 o'clock if your schedule genuinely allows it, sitting upright quietly in a straight back chair within a peaceful room, and working carefully with single clear affirmation, something along the general lines of consciously recognizing that the ruling power of the entire universe is, at this very moment, actively expressing itself directly through you as a specific individual. She is genuinely careful here to clarify explicitly that this particular kind of prayer or spiritual treatment is never, under any circumstances, a form of hypnotism and should never, ever involve any attempt whatsoever to impose your own personal will forcibly onto another person's mind against their wishes. Instead, it remains simply a steady, honest, ongoing process of carefully aligning your own private thought with first cause itself, examining your own heart thoughtfully for any lingering trace of fear, worry, envy, or resentment, and then gently cleansing those particular feelings away entirely through the calm recognition that divine love and purity genuinely fill the whole of space without exception, including your own heart and soul as well. Only after completing this careful process do you finally move into active affirmation, quietly and confidently declaring that your own genuine desire is already fulfilled in its first, original, purely spiritual form, well before it ever actually appears outwardly on the physical plane of everyday life. And Behrend closes out her extended instructions on prayer with one particularly wonderful and genuinely direct piece of encouragement. That dominion over your own life circumstances is, in fact, your rightful birthright, that you are, in her own memorable words, quite literally a prince of power, a beloved child of the king, and that recognizing this truth openly is never a matter of arrogance or presumption, but simply an entirely accurate description of your own actual existing relationship to the very creative power that originally brought you into being. In her final closing pages, Behrend leaves us with one last, genuinely striking reminder that she clearly wanted every reader to carry forward long after finishing this book. That the single greatest mental scientist the world has ever known was Jesus himself, who told us quite plainly and directly that all things are genuinely possible to us, and that the very same works he himself accomplished, we ourselves could accomplish as well, if only we would sincerely believe. He never once claimed any special exception purely for himself alone. She carefully reminds us he simply and consistently declared the entire human race, without exception, to be children of God, and the remarkable power he so clearly demonstrated throughout his life was power he had personally developed through his own sustained individual effort, the very same kind of effort that remains genuinely available to every single one of us today, if we are only willing to make it a truly great idea. Behrend insists firmly, remains entirely worthless and inert until a moment it is genuinely joined together with real, concrete physical action. God freely supplies the original idea, but it always falls squarely to us, as individuals, to work that idea out faithfully upon the physical plane of everyday life. And so she leaves her many readers with a simple set of daily questions worth carrying forward long after the book itself has been closed and set aside. What precisely is the true purpose of the very power that originally placed me here in this world? And how, practically and honestly, can I work each day in genuine harmony with that deeper purpose? And so we come together to the end of your invisible power, though truthfully, this really marks only the very beginning of what you now carry forward with you into your own life. Genevieve Behrend spent the whole of her remaining life teaching one single, remarkably elegant idea, that your own mind is never merely reacting passively to the world unfolding around it, but is instead actively shaping that world, moment by moment, through the pictures you consistently hold, the words you consistently speak, and the quiet faith with which you hold both steady over time. She showed us, through the winding course of her own remarkable personal journey, traveling from a genuinely lonely widow with no clear path forward in life, all the way to becoming the one and only personal student of the greatest mental scientist of her entire age, that none of this is merely abstract philosophy, but rather a working, thoroughly practical law. Every bit as dependable and exact as a physical law that lifts an airplane steadily into open sky, or the precise law that fixes a clear image permanently onto a photographic plate. You have heard, over the course of this recording, how one desperate man managed to rebuild his entire life, starting from half of a single $5 bill. How a young woman patiently picked her piano directly into the corner of her own living room. How one elderly woman's quiet, persistent faith met her precisely at the moment of her own deepest and most desperate need, and how Behrend herself, penniless perhaps in her outward circumstances, but genuinely rich in the clarity of her own inner picture, managed to attract both the exact sum of money and the exact teacher she truly needed, simply by holding her vision steady over time and stepping forward calmly and confidently whenever life itself finally showed her the way. The genuine invitation this remarkable book leaves you with, in the end, is a wonderfully simple one to carry forward. Decide clearly and specifically what you truly want. Hold the picture it gently but persistently in your own mind, morning and night without fail. Release your anxious grip on exactly how that outcome must eventually arrive, and then act without hesitation the very moment life shows you the next genuine step forward. Your own mind right now, in this very moment as you listen, is already a center of divine operation. The only genuine question left for you to answer is simply what you will now choose to create through going forward. If this particular book has stirred something meaningful within you today, if you felt even some small part of yourself quietly waking up while listening, please do take just a brief moment now to subscribe to this channel so that the very next voice from this great and enduring tradition of thought finds its way directly to you as well. Thank you so sincerely for spending this time together with Genevieve Behrend and with me. Until our next book together, go gently, hold your picture steady, and trust fully in the invisible power that is already, even now, quietly working on your behalf.